of legislation. I won't go over that. I want to turn my remarks though to the second reading amendment. And the focus of my speech will be to call out the Australian government's failure, the lack of care for international education and international students during the pandemic, and in particular, the Prime Minister's personal behaviour, his words, his lack of care and his lack of empathy for international students over the last 12 months. I say at the outset, I am a big supporter of international education in this country. Students enrich all of our cities, our regions, they enrich our communities and our campuses and places of study. They make our places more vibrant. It's also our fourth biggest, or it was before the pandemic, our fourth biggest export sector, worth more than $40 billion a year in export revenue to this country. It's the biggest single export sector in my home state of Victoria. The soft power, though, that we have accrued over decades to this nation as a result of international education is incalculable. We have educated, onshore, in their formative years, more than 1 million people from Southeast Asia and our region. You could not put value on that if you tried. And of course, the human capital, the talent that Australia has retained over many decades from people who've come here, bright in their society and decided to fall in love, stay, build a life in our country, is a wonderful thing for our country. We should be so proud of this sector. We should celebrate this success that we've achieved over decades at universities, at TAFEs, but also, I would say, sometimes overlooked, the many reputable and innovative private providers in the sector, the English language providers, which are important in their own right, but so often a feeder from people who come as tourists or backpackers and decide to stay, and it's a pathway. So in that context of such a wonderful thing for our country that is the international education sector, it is perplexing to see the government's lack of response for 12 months, to see the Prime Minister's personal behaviour or misbehaviour, and it at times has made me ashamed. The Prime Minister's lack of care, which I'll get to, is bad enough, but his blatant and overt hostility to international education and international students is outrageous. It's bad enough that there's been no national support provided, the only one of Australia's top 10 export sectors, which the government has done nothing for. Waiving a few fees, as this bill may allow to do, it's 5 cents off the table. It's a crumb off the government table as a tidal wave of economic devastation has been wrought over this sector. The tourism sector received $240 million of support in the previous budget, and yet 60% of the tourists in this country are international students or they're visiting friends and family and relatives. What's been done for the international sector? What's been done to providers, to student accommodation providers that are facing insolvency after July as the pipeline of students dry up? Nothing. No engagement, no support. All we hear from the government is blame the state. Somehow it's the state's fault. Well, it's not. It's our fourth biggest export sector. The Cabinet, we know, they won't admit it, but we know from sources, the Cabinet has rejected proposals brought by ministers last year to support this sector because of the Prime Minister and the Treasurer's personal hostility to doing anything. Unbelievably, not only, doing nothing would have been better, but the Prime Minister went out on national television as this emergency took hold and said to students, well, if you don't like it, go home. Go home. I don't think he could really understand the damage, the harm that that's done to our reputation and to the emotional well-being of students. I spoke to the CEO of one large accommodation provider who said literally the day after the Prime Minister said, well, go home, he had a queue of students at the front desk thinking they actually had to go home. They were paying fees, they were part of the community, they'd invested in their future. We should be so privileged that young people in their formative years decide to invest what in many cases is a fortune for their families. It's an investment in their future, their entire life, to pay tens of thousands of dollars to come and be kept safe in our community, to be cared for by our community, to spend their formative years in Australia. We should value this. But the Prime Minister told them to go home. It's no surprise. Remember when he was in trouble for his own government's failure to invest in infrastructure? He said, oh, well, if you can't get a seat on the train or you can't drive down the road because of congestion, don't blame me for not investing in new infrastructure. Blame the international students. They're taking a seat. I mean, what nonsense. This guy's got form. But I want to say very clearly to the international students who are here, to the hundreds of thousands of students right now that are paying top dollar We're a high-cost, high-quality provider in a very competitive market. High-quality, high-cost, very competitive market. We have hundreds of thousands of students right now offshore, unable to come into this country, who are still paying those fees, studying offshore and online. And I want to say to them, thank you. I want to say that Australians are a better people than we've been represented by our Prime Minister, who has not shown any care, any empathy, any recognition of the plight that you've suffered, the destitution that students have faced, seeing potentially life savings of their families threatened, being chucked out of work, being unable to pay their rent, being literally starving and relying on food vouchers. Not one word of care from the Prime Minister. Just a dismissive, arrogant, narcissistic, verging on sociopathic, "we'll go home." That embarrassed me, and I was ashamed as an Australian at his lack of care. International students deserved a lot better than they've had from this mean, miserable government. And it does not represent the views of Australians. You are welcome here, and we look forward to the day where students are able to come back onshore and study in our communities. Now, we've seen in the last few days, in the most tragic, the most vile of circumstances, the Prime Minister's lack of empathy, his lack of human compassion, his narcissistic response. And so if, as we've been told, as we've witnessed, the nation has witnessed, the Prime Minister can only understand the plight of others through thinking about his own children, then I ask, how would the Prime Minister feel if one of his children was stranded in a foreign country during a global pandemic, starving, kicked out of their place of employment, unable to support themselves? Would he like the host country to show a little care, a little compassion? I would hope so, just as other countries that aren't Australia have shown, like the UK and Canada and all our competitors and peers. So that's bad enough. But it's also damaged our national interest. As I said, this is a $40 billion export sector. Can anyone really imagine this government pouring scorn on the coal industry or the iron ore industry or the gas industry or the agriculture industry or the tourism industry? For some reason, it's only international education that has their back turned on them. Overt hostility from this government. I do not get it. I have never understood it. His predecessors didn't have this view. There is something wrong with this Prime Minister. There's something not right about him. It's just a bizarre hostility, and it should stop. I mean, seriously, lobsters got their own planes to be flown overseas, and students got nothing. Let's have a look at the jobs impact, though. More than 250,000 jobs in Australia have rested on this sector last financial year. 250,000 jobs. That is more than the entire mining sector. It's more than the entire agricultural sector. It's a service sector. It's jobs intensive. As I said, 60% of tourists to this country are international students or they're visiting friends and relatives. It's bad enough we've seen the job losses of tens of thousands now in universities, but reputable private providers and accommodation providers are facing insolvency. These are businesses that won't come back. We're about to see the end of JobKeeper. There's quite rightly calls for sectoral recognition for the tourism sector. Sectors that rely on the borders being open for the businesses to survive warrant particular attention. And I say very clearly to the government, put the international education sector on that list of sectors that deserve some support. They're worthy of support. They need help for the next 6 to 12 months till we can get through this crisis. Now, a few suggestions. These have been messaged to the Prime Minister by the peak bodies, falling on deaf ears. Letters have been sent recently again to the Prime Minister and the National Cabinet, all the Chief Ministers. And look, the states and territories' performance has been better than the national government, but still at times a bit slow and a bit patchy. The first thing that we need from the government is positive messaging. Not telling students to go home. That ricocheted around social media. It destroys our future pipeline, our marketing and recruitment pipeline, if nothing else. If you just want to be mercenary about it and not human and empathetic. I mean, how do you think that does to a word-of-mouth sector? As a leading education CEO told me a few months ago, we're trying to work with the government, but the major negative is the messaging from Morrison, rolling out the unwelcome mat and highlighting a lack of support for students. If we can get things right, though, we're in the box seat. We've got huge potential advantages from this crisis, because the states and territories have managed the health response so well. The second thing we need is some kind of an indicative return date, as the UK and Canada have kept their borders open. Now, I understand, of course, that we're in a different context, being an island continent, and we treasure that. But it's the government's failure, the Prime Minister's failure to take responsibility for quarantine months ago as his own report that he asked for said, it's a national responsibility, but he just wants to blame the states. If he'd done that months ago when he had that report, we would not have this impossible choice between 41,000 stranded Australians on whom the Prime Minister has turned his back. Turn back the boats. At that point, he's responsible for borders and quarantine. You wouldn't find a politician in this place who's banged on more about borders and quarantine, but when it comes to 41,000 stranded Australians, turns his back on them. And the same with international students. If he hadn't created this mess over the last 12 months, we would be able to be bringing students in safely and securely and save tens of thousands of jobs. We shouldn't be in this choice. And as I said, we also need some targeted industry assistance to this sector, which is more than warranted. $0 for international education, $240 million for tourism. Says it all. Final thing I'll just say is, please, a little more empathy for the plight. I know that we can't bring students back right now. We could have before we saw these contagious strains emerge. We could have done that safely if the Prime Minister had brought the citizens home and done his job, as it says in the Constitution, and stepped up to manage quarantine. But we are where we are. But some empathy. Imagine, as I've had the emails, because students understand I actually care about this sector because I've spoken about it, and you get terrible stories. Imagine the plight of a 4th or 5th year dental student who's invested hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than their entire family's wealth, in their future. Their last year, and they're unable to come back onshore and complete it. They're distraught. Students have told us, we've seen cases of literally attempting suicide because they feel they have no future left. A little empathy, a little hope at least, to help people get through these circumstances. People like that are in limbo. And the truth is, Australia has relied on some of these medical and dental students actually staying because they're the ones that go to regional areas and provide these desperately needed medical specialists in regional areas. This is, again, a selfish national interest, not just a moment of human empathy. I'll finish with a quote from a simple email. It's a very simple email from one of the student advocates who loves Australia. Their palpable love for Australia and Australians shines through, despite the way in which I believe they've been profoundly mistreated by this heartless, cruel Liberal government. And I think it does stem, not because all members of the government are evil, nasty and cruel, but I really think culture comes from the top. The Prime Minister's lack of human compassion, lack of empathy on display for the nation this week has driven this lack of care and attention and response. He owns it. This email said, many students have had a tough year. They've had many significant issues, educational, financial and personal, due to the uncertain situations, but most of them are very disappointed about the Australian government and give up. Some are happy to learn online at home. Therefore, only students who have partners in Australia are craving to come back ASAP. I suggest if the government could open the border even to those few students with compassionate reasons. Imagine a student who's never met their child because they had to go home, and yet they're Australian partners here with the baby that they've never met. We've spoken to these people. Show some compassion. Students have been anxious, they've been isolated, they've faced destitution. They just want some help, or at least stop the harm and show some care and empathy from the government. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.